On August 8, 1992, the two biggest rock bands on the planet shared the exact same stage. What was supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of heavy metal quickly mutated into one of the darkest, most violent disasters in music history. This is not a story of rock and roll glory or triumph. This is the brutal story of how out of control egos, a horrifying near-fatal explosion, and 53,000 furious fans literally set a city on fire. To truly understand the sheer scale of this disaster, you have to look at the massive collision course these two bands were on. In the early 90s, both groups were untouchable giants, but their philosophies clashed violently. Metallica was an unstoppable, disciplined machine of pure thrash metal. They walked on stage exactly on time, played with military precision, and never gave excuses. Guns N' Roses, led by an incredibly unpredictable Axl Rose, operated in a state of constant, exhausting chaos. For Guns N' Roses, delayed start times of 2 or 3 hours, massive backstage tantrums, and last-minute cancellations were simply business as usual. Putting these two absolute opposites on a massive stadium tour together seemed like the greatest financial idea of the decade. Millions of dollars were at stake, and stadiums were sold out everywhere. But behind the scenes, the tension was suffocating. By the time they arrived at the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, Canada, it was no longer just a concert. It was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in front of 53,000 screaming people. Metallica took the stage first, and the energy inside the stadium was electric. The band was firing on all cylinders, delivering a crushing set that had 53,000 fans in a frenzy. However, behind the scenes, a lethal lack of communication was developing between the band and the pyrotechnics crew. The stage was rigged with massive columns of magnesium fire, designed to explode from the floor during specific cues. But as the band started playing the dark intro to Fade to Black, the technical setup was changed without everyone being fully aware of the new positions. James Hetfield, caught in the heat of the performance, stepped directly onto a spot where he thought it was safe. In that exact microsecond, a towering pillar of chemical fire, burning at over 3,000 degrees, erupted directly underneath him. The crowd watched in absolute horror as a massive ball of light swallowed the Metallica frontman. James was literally engulfed in flames in front of everyone. The heat was so intense it melted the layers of skin on his left arm, his hand, and scorched the side of his face and hair. The physical pain was beyond description, and James collapsed as his guitar was partially melted by the blast. The music stopped instantly. The members of Metallica ran toward their fallen brother, fearing they had just witnessed his death on live television. James was rushed backstage in a state of shock, his skin reportedly hanging off his arm as he was carried to an emergency vehicle. As he was being driven to a Montreal hospital with 2nd and 3rd degree burns, the stadium fell into a terrifying, eerie silence. The show was over for Metallica, but for the 53,000 people in the stands, the nightmare was only beginning. The pressure now shifted entirely to Guns N' Roses to save the night, but they were about to make everything 10 times worse. With James Hetfield on his way to the hospital, the burden of saving the night fell squarely on the shoulders of Guns N' Roses. The crowd had just seen a rock legend burn alive. They were terrified, confused, and desperate for the music to continue. All Axl Rose had to do was show up, play a solid set, and show some respect to the audience and his fallen tourmates. But instead of rushing to the stage to heal the night, Guns N' Roses did the one thing that guaranteed a disaster. They made the crowd wait. For over 2 hours, 53,000 people sat in the dark, their adrenaline turning into bitter resentment. When Guns N' Roses finally decided to walk out, the atmosphere was already toxic. Instead of acknowledging the tragedy or apologizing for the delay, Axl Rose seemed irritated and disconnected. He began the show with a lack of energy that felt like an insult to everyone who had paid for a ticket. But the real breaking point came only a few songs into their set, when Axl decided he had had enough. Claiming that the stage monitors were wrong and that his throat hurt, Axl Rose stopped mid-song. He looked at the massive crowd, muttered a cold goodbye, and simply walked off the stage, followed by a confused band. The house lights came on, and an announcer told the exhausted fans that the show was officially over. In that moment, the collective shock of the crowd snapped. They had waited hours, they had seen a man burn, and now they were being abandoned by a prima donna. The silence lasted only a second before the stadium exploded into a war zone. The moment the lights came on and the cancellation was confirmed, 53,000 people transformed into a single, violent mob. The Olympic Stadium erupted into a scene of pure carnage. Fans began ripping the heavy plastic seats from the floor and hurling them toward the stage like missiles. They smashed the expensive lighting rigs, tore down the massive sound systems, and looted the merchandise stands. The stage, which only hours ago was meant to hold the kings of rock, was being dismantled by a sea of angry humans in a matter of minutes. The violence didn't stay inside the stadium walls. The mob poured out into the streets of Montreal, and the city was completely unprepared for the level of rage they encountered. Thousands of people began overturning police cars and setting them on fire, sending plumes of thick black smoke into the night sky. Storefront windows were shattered, and looters took whatever they could carry. It looked like a scene from an apocalyptic movie. The authorities were forced to call in hundreds of riot police who used tear gas and clubs to try and regain control of the downtown area. By the early hours of the morning, the smoke began to clear, revealing millions of dollars in property damage. Dozens of people were hospitalized with serious injuries, and the streets were littered with broken glass and charred debris. This wasn't just a concert gone wrong anymore. It was a national scandal. The news of the Montreal Riot flashed across television screens all over the world, showing the raw, ugly side of rock and roll excess. The tour that was supposed to define a generation had instead left a trail of fire and broken lives across Canada. The Montreal Riot was the final nail in the coffin for the era of untouchable rock gods. While James Hetfield spent months in agonizing physical therapy, literally relearning how to play the guitar with his scarred hand, the reputation of Guns N' Roses was permanently damaged. The music industry began to realize that the fans were tired of the arrogance and the danger. The public's hunger for authentic, grounded artists grew, opening the door for the grunge movement from Seattle to take over the world. Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam offered the reality that fans were craving after being burned both literally and figuratively by the excesses of the 80s. Metallica eventually returned to the stage, proving their legendary resilience. But they never looked at stadium pyrotechnics the same way again. James Hetfield carries the scars of that night on his skin to this day, a permanent reminder of how close he came to losing everything. On the other hand, Axl Rose became a symbol of the self-destruction that occurs when ego becomes more important than the music. The legendary 1992 tours, which was meant to be a celebration of power, ended as a cautionary tale about the limits of human patience and the volatility of rock and roll. Looking back, the fires in Montreal marked the moment the old world of heavy metal began to crumble. It wasn't just a riot, it was a shift in the cultural landscape. The chaos of that night forced the industry to prioritize safety and respect for the audience, changing the way live music is produced forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into rock's most dangerous night, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the history of music. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Axl Rose was responsible for the riot, or was the crowd's reaction justified?